Hi, this is Paul, and many of you remember Roland. Roland and I have talked about philosophy. Roland is a citizen of the Netherlands, and one of the things that I wanted to talk about today, because I know nothing about it, is this system of pillars in the Netherlands. Now, you might not have heard of this system, but well, Roland, why don't you explain a little bit what pillars are in the Netherlands and how they came about and what they were designed to do?
All right. Well, pillars are basically, or pillarisation, or a system of pillars. So it is the institutional segregation of different communities based on worldview, or religious or ideological. Basically what happened it started in the 19th century, and you had basically the liberals, or the classical liberals, we would say right now. You had them dominate the government institutions, and the socialists were also quite organized, but not they weren't very powerful yet in the parliament. And the schools, well, even though the Netherlands was very religious at that time, all the schools were just government secular schools. So what happened was that different communities started to organize themselves along religious and ideological lines for different objectives. For example, to let their voices be heard in the political sphere, to increase their influence on the community and on the country as a whole, to keep people inside the faith, for example, or the ideology, to train people in their within their worldview. And so these pillars were just basically really, in the end, they became a total segregation of almost all institutions people ordinarily participate in. So the most important were churches, of course. I mean, that was already the case, but it was mostly based on the churches. So you had a Protestant pillar. It wasn't perfectly the same. There were actually, it was kind of, there was different Protestant communities, so it wasn't all one monolith. And then you had the Roman Catholics, the socialists, and eventually also the liberals. Were basically, well, I mean, they were a smaller group of, well, I mean, the upper class, basically, the capitalists, Marx would say. And and they started their own schools, for example, their own political parties, eventually newspapers, magazines. In the 50s and 60s, they had their own broadcasting corporations, state-funded, actually. University, the Free University in Amsterdam, where I'm studying at the moment, started as a pillarized organization by the Reformed pillar of Abraham Kuyper, and it was founded on this religious idea, and it trained young Reformed people to, for example, become ministers. That was one of the first objectives, but also all kinds of other jobs. So there were even more. I mean, labor unions, for example, also they were segregated. At the moment, there's even an insurance company that's basically a pillarized. Hospitals, other associations, youth organizations, student organizations, all that kind of stuff. So it was, and in the past, I mean, the height of pillarization was basically at the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. So, and after the Second World War, especially in the 60s and later, most of the pillars, or pretty much all of the pillars, collapsed. But before that, you had it was so segregated that you had just you could just live in the same town, but never really interact. with people of a fundamentally different persuasion.
Hmm.
And so you could even go to you were Reformed, and you would go to the Reformed baker and the Reformed grocery store sometimes, and that kind of stuff. So it was really, it was very deeply embedded in the society in the past. But yeah, I mean, and what I am myself part of is, you could say, the last real pillar that's still left at the moment. And that is the small Reformed churches. So basically Calvinist churches, of course. They're not that big, a couple 100,000 people in total, I think. And the interesting fact is that their pillarization actually seemed to have started more in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because the rest of the Netherlands was rapidly secularizing, and schools were secularizing, and all institutions were secularizing, and suddenly these small churches, well, just they were out alone almost, and not entirely, of course, but so they started their own organizations, and right now they got their own schools. They got primary schools across the Bible Belt mostly, but also at some other places. Even secondary schools, middle schools, high schools as well. So for me, what it meant was that I was in Reformed schools from 4 to 18 until I went to university. So that's really, really, really important and weird. And so
Well, I
we have
did
not.
too. I was too. Because
That's interesting.
The Dutch who immigrated to the United States. Now, you mentioned that these pillars, these weren't a government program. This is what people did privately and on their own.
Yeah.
And because it's interesting, when the Dutch immigrants came to the United States, they formed a pillar, but I had never heard the word. But that was what the Christian Reformed Church did.
Yeah.
We had the Holland Home, we had Christian schools, we had, and then especially when the immigrants came to the United States after the war, these Kuyperians were very much about, we're going to have Christian this and Christian that, and so when I heard you describe the pillars, I thought, oh my goodness, I grew up in one, but nobody told me I was in one, because that's what the Christian Reformed Church did.
That's so weird. That's so, yeah, of course. I mean, it's logical. I mean, if you migrate, but you take your ideas with you and your practices, and I mean, it is really effective, I think, in keeping the community together, in binding people together. It's also sometimes a way, in some sense, it's a way of social control over members as well. I mean. Yeah. So it is positive, and sometimes you need social cohesion as well. So I wouldn't qualify this as negative in necessarily. But yeah, I mean that does mean that you're very protected, and you don't. For example, I grew up and I had no Christian friends. I mean, I sometimes played with like the neighbors.
You had no non-Christian friends.
No non-Christian friends. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I watched that. But yeah, luckily I did have friends. But yeah, I mean, we sometimes played with the neighbors, the kids, and but that was pretty much it, and there wasn't really any deep friendship or anything. So. And in school you were taught the same thing as in church and as at home, and like so it really forms you in a deep way. And I mean that's also partly the point of it.
It is the point of it. Now, have you heard?
I mean, there are some other purposes like political and influence and cultural influence, but I think especially in the case of the small Reformed pillar, the biggest purpose is protection of especially of young people, but also of older people.
Yeah, well, protection of young people. And then in the Christian Reformed pillar of the United States, we were all went to school in it. We were formed in it. Then we went to Calvin College. So we made sure we married in it. And
yeah, that's important too.
Yeah. Yeah. And you just, I didn't. My wife wasn't a member of the Christian Reformed. Well, she did join, but yeah, you stayed in your pillar. And what's interesting, have you heard of Rod Dreher and the Benedict option?
I've heard talk about it on YouTube. And then basically, as far as I mean, people take it to be that Christians should like self-segregate and just retreat from all secular institutions. And I mean, a little bit going like the Amish.
Yeah, I don't think he actually recommends it that far. But whenever I listen to Rod Dreher talk about the Benedict option, I think about what the Christian Reformed Church was really until the 60s and 70s in North America. And at that point, it's very interesting that the Christian Reformed Church in North America, we often wonder if we're 20 years behind the Dutch church because and listening to you describe, the giving up in the broader society of this pillar dynamic. And again, I want to stress this wasn't a government program. This was from the ground up. These were individuals self-selecting, building their own institutions. That's my understanding of it, correct?
Yeah, I mean, not strictly grassroots, but you had visionaries like Kuiper and others. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church had its own organization that could help. So there were socialist organizations, and there were some organizations and people that took the lead and organized and support and made sure made people enthusiastic about it and to for example, to fund the free university. It was really, I mean, the school ran for a long time without any government funding the university, and it was all paid for by donations by the Reformed little people, or kleine luiden was it in Dutch, and they paid for it, and so it was. I mean, it wasn't like coming from the people like purely grassroots. It was also. But you need sometimes you need leaders, you need visionaries that set things up and people follow them, and I think that's very much how it went.
Now, except for some of the small conservative Reformed churches that, as you said, ironically got into the game late, probably to try to wall themselves off from broader secularizing forces in the Netherlands. What's your take on the end of, let's call it, mainstream pillarisation in the Netherlands? Why did it break down? Was it a good thing? What's your take on that?
I mean, why did it break down? That's a pretty difficult historical question, and I'm not necessarily qualified to give a very sure answer to it. But as far as I have done some historical investigation that was not strictly about this topic, but it touched on it, and what it seems like is that there was quite a big gap between practice and like what people were doing and what they believed or what they were supposed to believe, and a lot of these churches were basically becoming, I mean, what would you call it? Just the rituals, the institutions were there, but they weren't really alive very well. The conviction, it was more complacency and just. I know also, I suppose, I mean, what's often said is that the war made a big difference as well, because the Netherlands was under German occupation for 5 years roughly.
And it's a very brutal occupation.
Yes, and we lost like over 70% of our Jews, the Dutch Jews, and that was really, really, I mean, bad. But that wasn't even the most important, just post-war period. Later, there was more more attention was given to the Jews, but I mean, it is difficult to say, but at least what it was is that the churches weren't really, they weren't really. The conviction was gone, the commitment, and that made people very vulnerable to secularizing forces like the television and movies, and which were often, well, I mean, deliberately anti, or at least anti the Christian traditional morality, I would say. So, and if there's just little that binds you to the pillar, then I mean, why stay? And it seems that's kind of the process that happened, and it was a true collapse in some sense, especially the Roman Catholics, but also the socialists in a way. Right now, of the Catholics that are still registered as Catholics, like 1 in 20 regularly attends Mass.
Wow.
1 in 20.
Wow.
So nominally, there's like still 1 million Roman Catholics in the Netherlands, or maybe no, I think even much more, but I'm not entirely sure. But I am sure of the figure that 1 in 20 is like serious about it. And I mean, there's lots of stuff happening in the Catholic Church right now, but that's not helping. And yeah, so it really was a total collapse. In the Reformed churches didn't do much better. Kuiper's church, only the small churches in a way, probably because they were, well, more insulated in a way, and there was more of a sense of conviction maybe as well. As I've and maybe also a kind of a more instinctive reaction against the outside world and the secular world. So, well, I mean, I can't say exactly why, of course. I mean, that's very difficult to determine with any degree of certainty. But right now, I mean, as I grew up, it was, people are taking, in our churches, many people take their faith extremely seriously, and that's a really important part of it. And if people stop doing that, then the pillar is gone.
When you say they take their faith extremely seriously, what kind of practices do you mean?
Well, especially going to church twice a Sunday for at least 1.5 hours each, with a sermon which is often an hour, with maybe one small break for some singing.
Longer preaching, yeah.
Yeah.
YouTube gives me lots of time, more than the service gives me.
Yeah. But that's actually, I mean, people when they hear that, it's amazing. I mean, how do you get used to listen to a sermon like for an hour? That's crazy. I mean, but it happens, and I mean, but also other things. I mean, it's also kind of your tight group, so people, yeah, you look after each other in both ways, and but what is also part of it is a lot of. I mean, it depends on whether whether your faith is really a conviction, or whether it's more like habit and tradition. Because in that way, I mean, you could describe it as following a lot of rules, like no television and no pants, trousers for women, for example, and jewelry is often was like earrings, and so it was a little bit not. I mean, was not very accepted, and there's many more, and just clothing and activities you could do. But that was probably for quite some people that's rules to follow, I would say. Yeah.
But now you're a student at the Free University now.
Yes.
And you mentioned that the Free University used to be supported solely by the church community, by its pillar.
Yeah.
And now it's a public school.
Basically, eventually it got government recognition and funding, so it no longer had to rely on its own funds. And even though, I mean, at the same time when the reformed pillar was collapsing, I think the Vrije Universiteit, or Free University, it also secularized. And I mean, just a couple of years back, they changed what's it called, the foundational statement or something of the university, and it removed that it was based on the Bible and the Reformed faith or something. So basically, right now it's not really a religious university anymore, even though in practice it hasn't been for a long time, probably. So, but I mean, you get the deadwood, the articles that aren't changed but don't mean anything anymore, and so a couple of years back they just thought, well, this article doesn't mean anymore. Let's just mean anything anymore. Let's just remove it. So basically, it's a secular university, but it does have the most important. It is the most important seminary for Protestant ministers in the Netherlands. The theology, and they studied theology there, most of them. Not from my church, by the way. They have their own university, which is more orthodox, because I mean the theology it's like pretty broad, and it can be pretty critical of orthodoxy. So and there's also quite a lot of Christian philosophy as well in the philosophy department, which is of course in a way closely linked to the theology department. But yes, so there's still a little bit of Christianity left at Free University, but we're very diverse and multicultural as well. A lot of Muslim students, for example. So yeah, that's basically what it is now.
Now, probably in English, a lot of people are confused by the name, because when they hear Free University, they hear Bernie Sanders promising free community college. But free doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you have to pay to go, does it?
No, that's right. I mean, even in the Netherlands, college isn't free. I mean, I pay $2,000 at least, like $2,000 for a year for just tuition, which is doable. Of course, it's not crazy, but I have to pay for my own books and the like, and I do get some funding from the government, because my parents can't really support me, so that's very useful. But it's not like I'm getting a free lunch. But
it's not like I've got 3 kids in college this year, and one of them's going to a state school, and if he were only paying $2,000, we'd be really happy. 2,000 plus books. So I mean, the American audience is going to hear this and just kind of roll their eyes, because my daughters, for Calvin College, for example, 20 to 30,000 a year is pretty much what you'd pay.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's crazy.
I mean, if you, for example, if you in Netherlands, if you, I mean, there's a point, if you have finished your a bachelor's degree on the university in the Netherlands, you can't get another one not with government funding. So if you do a second degree after you finished your first, then you have to pay just what it costs, and that's around $10,000 a year.
Yeah,
basically. So that would be, I suppose, comparable to a private college in the United States, in a
No, that's
sense.
comparable to a state school in the United States, maybe. So yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
I know
quite
it's.
as a situation, but not as the
But
cost.
our taxes are lower. That's
Yes,
the trade-off
yes, we pay for it.
in your
I mean, I
taxes.
don't pay for it, so I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
too
No,
I'm not
Americans, if
miserable.
Americans knew what you paid in taxes, because I've had that conversation
Yeah,
with others who have lived there. Um,
yeah,
pretty dramatic.
yeah. The highest income tax rate is 52%, actually, and most people don't really pay that because you get um, if you can subtract your mortgage interest payments from your taxable income. So um, most people don't really pay 52%, luckily. But it starts at 52%. It starts at like I think less than 60,000 euros. So that's pretty early.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
would be considered middle class in America, I think, and then you pay 52% normally. I mean, not
yeah.
effectively, but it's still a lot of money, and you got a VAT tax as well. Um, so yeah, we do pay for it in a way.
Pretty heavily taxed. Well,
Yeah,
getting back to the pillars, any other? I mean, because it's interesting to me this, because I'd never heard about this, and then I heard a couple of people talking about it, and you had mentioned it once, and I didn't quite know what you were talking about. And then
oh,
as you
yeah,
describe it, I think, how do I not know what he's talking about? I grew up in one, but of course they didn't call it that. That was just what Christian Reformed people practiced when they came to the United
yeah,
States. We had our schools, we had our churches, business. You were kind of out in the world, but then again, in the 70s and 80s, really, it broke down, and the Christian Reformed Church, much more assimilated, and the church had a, it was a very complex process, very much tied to other social changes going on in the
yeah.
United States. So what are your reflections on this? Do you think this is something that the Dutch should relearn, or is it good that it's gone, or what do you think?
I mean, from the viewpoint of a religious community, it has big advantages, of course, but it also has disadvantages, and that's um, that you get a lot of people that um, yeah, I mean, basically you don't need you don't need to come to terms with your own faith if you don't really want to. You can stick to your tradition and your practices and your habits, and you won't really be confronted with the outside world, with all the challenges and dangers um, and the problems it presents. Insulation can make people weaker if you don't get challenged a lot. If you do get, for example, if you move to, you're 18 years old and you've always been to reform schools, and then you go to university, that's a huge shock. um, uh, because I mean, high school was really a reformed school, was it? So it does have quite a lot of advantages. I mean, I think um, schools. I mean, it's not like the schools are religious in the sense that all the um, all the courses and all the stuff that people learn, that students learn, is religious. I mean, you just get math. You're held to the same standards as other schools, actually, in the Netherlands. Schools based on some kind of worldview, either religious or otherwise. That's like 2/3 of all schools. So most children in the Netherlands go to schools that are based on some kind of religious or other worldview. It's just that most of those are just they don't really do anything with it, especially the Protestant and the Catholic based schools. It's just remnants of the past, basically, and maybe sometimes you have a little bit of a religious education and the like, but it's really the Reformed pillar schools that really take it seriously, and those are rather small in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
So but I mean, apart from the question whether they're good or not, I think they are very difficult to uphold in the 21st century. And what I've seen also around me, and while I grew up, because when I was young, when I was like 6 or something, the first computers started to get into to make their way into the homes, and smartphones basically was while I was in secondary high school/high school. So I've seen the change, and suddenly everyone got their computers, and me and my friends all got their laptops and PCs, and right now everyone's got a smartphone, of course, and it's like 10 years ago the first one was released. So the forces of both internet, smartphones, and social media, they make if you look at a pillar, it's just like a sort of a protective layer, you could say. But there are 3 giant holes in it, and the first hole is the internet, the second is social media, and the third is smartphones. And you can't keep. I mean, you can keep your TV, for example. That was a big deal in the 70s, especially. Reformed people refused to buy TVs, and that was also socially enforced in some ways. And of course, that's
Socially enforced, not government enforced.
No.
Like Jordan Peterson's enforced monogamy.
No, you definitely don't. And so, but that's doable. But you can't keep computers out. You don't really want to in many ways. I mean, I couldn't be talking with you if I didn't have a computer.
That's right.
So
That's right.
And so I don't really spend much time on social media, but most people find them indispensable. And I mean, the internet, and I do have my smartphone. I do a lot of WhatsApp, for example. But what you see is that even, I mean, it starts even the age children get their first smartphone, for example, it goes down every year. And so you now have primary school children of like 10 years old, they have their own smartphone, or even earlier. And I mean, how are you going to protect them, or to keep outside influences out of their lives? It's just impossible. So at this point, I mean, this development is still underway, and I mean, what it ultimately will bring about is still unclear. But it's probably going to be less like a pillar, because you just can't protect your children against the outside world. And you've got young children that watch YouTube videos, for example, and with all the clickbait and the dubious things people do to get views, sexual, for example, but also violence and all kind of gossip and the like. I mean, those are all things that are problematic for Christians, and they're all there. And then, I mean, how are you going to control? There are some applications that try to do this, and to help parents and young people to actually keep their internet use in check, and that's very useful. I got on my phone, I got an app that monitors how much I use it, and it was pretty shocking, actually, and it has gone down significantly since I used that app, because I just I couldn't live with myself if I spent 2-3 hours each day on my phone. That's just ridiculous. But those are, I mean, most people aren't really like that, I think. So I think the pillar is just, I think it's going to be a thing of the past, and people will need to rely on their inner convictions and their social community to stick to their faith, and they will need to learn to fight, or they will lose, and so they need to fight young and early. And if you don't, then well, I mean, there's so many temptations. You got a little box in your in your pants, and it is all the temptations of the world, just a finger click away. And I mean, it's a problem for everyone, not just Christians and not just reformed, pillarized, protected youth. So I mean, it's one of the biggest challenges to society probably right now. So the pillar is going to be destroyed. I mean, it's not certain that the institutions are all going to disappear or something. We'll have to see, but it is possible that things will get smaller, and only the people who really believe in their principles will stick together, and others will leave.
Well, I think, you know, something that's interesting to watch is, you know, when you mention people are left to their own resources, I mean, part of what, especially small churches, often why they form in terms of countercultural groups, is that we realize if I'm left up to my own resources, I'm in trouble, which is why you have accountability groups, you have AA, you have a lot of, you know, you have 12-step groups, you've got a lot of groups that say, here's a common thing that we need to covenant together with, because if left up to my own resources, I'm going to fail. And, you know, there's a whole movement, an anti-technology movement that goes on. Some of the most popular schools in the Bay Area, where the people who are actually producing this stuff send their kids, are Waldorf schools, which are dramatically anti-technology. You know, although my wife
iPads.
Yeah.
No phones.
And so my wife teaches in a Waldorf school, and this is a constant battle that they have underway. But you're exactly right that this is, you know, this is a battle. And I do wonder if actually the increasing realization of our vulnerability to ourselves might in some ways, and this I think is where Rod Dreher comes along, might in some ways motivate individuals to form communities to, in a sense, repillar, because they realize we can't do this by ourselves, that we need accountability, we need a community around us. Otherwise, we're simply going to fall victim to corporations and the technologies that they are employing to penetrate more deeply into our heads and our eyes and our wallets, which is what's motivating them. So
I would immediately send my kids, if I had any, to such a school, right? If I mean, it's I mean, it's really, it seems to really destroy the kids' ability to focus and to stay focused and concentrated. And that's just, I mean, I'm doing my studies right now. I'm mostly on my own. I don't have that many lectures, a couple a week, but if I don't keep my phone use and my other things in check, then there's going to come nothing of my degree.
That's right.
It's going to go up in flames. So,
that's right.
But the difference with the past is that you gotta choose voluntarily to join or to stick with a community, and there's no longer anyone who can make the choice for you if you don't really yourself. So if it corresponds with your real commitments, and if in practice your commitment is to your social media or whatever, you're all the kinds of temptations that fly around. There's not, the school isn't going to stop you, the church isn't going to stop you. No one really is, except for yourself.
But if you're
or God, of course.
But if you're all alone in it, I mean, and that hopefully is part of what we want from the church, is to help us fight against ourselves in some ways, because, you know, I can sit and make resolutions all day long in my head, but if I'm not living in community and in some kinds of accountability that force me to do the kinds of things I really don't want to do, then I'm going to become the kind of person I really don't want to become. And I know I'm capable of that. I know I know what's inside of
Easy.
me. Yeah, it's very easy. It's the path. It's the
You
broad.
just don't have to do anything.
That's right. It's the broad path, as Jesus calls it, and instead of the narrow path. And I don't think, I don't think there's anything new about this. I think the capacity to penetrate what had been traditional boundaries has just gotten greater, which then you have, you push and push back. And so it's very interesting, again, to see, listening to this pillar conversation and thinking about Rod Dreher's Benedict option. And I don't, I've got mixed feelings about his Benedict option, because again, I grew up in a Christian Reformed Benedictine community, as it were, because we stuck to our own, and that was a buffer. And many ways I look back and say I was really blessed by that. But like you say, I was a hothouse tomato. Hothouse plant is in some ways weaker than the one. I mean, this perpetual dynamic of inside versus outside. We've got just a couple of minutes. Any final thing, and then we'll shut down the recording, and you and I can just touch base a little bit after that before I'm on to my next conversation. So,
yeah, sure. I just one thing, I suppose. I still see a lot of value. I mean, I totally agree with you that the communities, they can no longer protect you against all the threats of the outside world, and that goes for everyone. And but what they can do is they can help you fight it. They can give you the resources. They can support you if you're down. They can help you stand up again, and they can help you find meaning in what you do, and love you, give you the support and the love that we all need to lead a truly good life.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Roland. Thanks for being willing to talk on the air with me, and just stay right here, and I'm going to end the recording. And
my pleasure.